This is for the March 6th online Ad-Astra tournament. Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Author George Orwell uses this quote in his novel 1984 to illustrate that if we lose our freedom of speech, we are left unable to defend what we believe to be the truth. While 1984 is classified as a historical fiction novel, in it Orwell parallels the book's theme with real-life instances of violation of free expression. His satire exposes the dangers of limiting free speech and the totalitarian rule that results. Since our founding fathers drafted the First Amendment to the Constitution, which states that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech, we have struggled with a clear definition of what constitutes free speech. As a result, people and organizations have tried to label others' opinions as hate speech as a way to silence them. Most recently, social media companies have demonstrated the power to cancel people because of comments that others find unpleasant. If we continue to let any entity decide what is or isn't allowed regarding our freedom of speech, we will gradually lose the right to speak our minds, as evidenced in other countries. While I'm not a proponent of hate speech, and while I might find restricting offensive speech tempting, it is ultimately not worth the cost, due to the effect it will have on our First Amendment rights. Therefore, we must protect our freedom of expression diligently by not allowing any restrictions on speech. Today, I will be exploring the problems created by limiting free speech, by first looking at why people want to censor certain speech, then showing you how freedom of speech in the United States is already being restricted, followed by looking at the effects of limiting free speech. Finally, I'll explain how, without our freedom of speech, we are left with an illusion of a free country in which our rights aren't truly protected and our politics are skewed because the truth cannot penetrate through the layer of laws regarding what is and isn't acceptable speech. Let's first look at why people want to censor certain speech. The main reason focuses primarily on what is labeled as hate speech. This term is used to refer to speaking with the intent to insult, offend, or intimidate a person because of some trait. The problem with this term's definition is that it's subjective. What is or isn't offensive varies based on who you are. For example, in the article Why Freedom of Speech Needs Limitations, author Shiza Arshad Iqbal states that if we had had laws against hate speech, people like Donald Trump would never have made it within 100 miles of politics, and Fox News would likely have so many cases against it that it would have to shut down. People and organizations like these two would be silenced, and their opinions and information never shared. Another example of the tolerance we must possess is kneeling for the national anthem. While many find it offensive, it must be allowed because it is a form of expressing our freedom of expression. We have become a sensitive culture in which having an opposing viewpoint can easily be seen by others as hate speech and an attack, when in reality, they're only being presented with information that they do not want to listen to. Jonathan Turley, an American attorney and legal scholar, writes, "Disinformation and hate speech have always existed as a part of human interactions. Free speech does not cure stupidity, it merely exposes it. Therefore, while hate speech is not desirable, it is still a part of free speech." After being summoned by the Un-American Committee and blacklisted for unsubstantiated accusations of communism, Arthur Miller stated that orthodoxy is the enemy of free speech, and orthodox values often stem from religious or social views, as stated in a PBS article about McCarthyism. Consequently, people are now claiming that other people's opinions is hate speech, and therefore are having the ability to cancel them. As a result, viewpoints are being silenced. Another issue is that people are now claiming that canceling others who make hate speeches is part of their free speech. Now that we have seen why people want to limit certain speech, let's take a look at how speech in the United States has already been restricted. In May 2020, David Shore, a researcher, tweeted a comment comparing the effects of nonviolent and violent protests on election turnouts. In response to this tweet, Ari Trujillo-Wessler, a co-founder of OpenField, stated that Shore's comment minimized Black grief and rage. Shortly after, Shore was fired. People like Shore will now hesitate to comment on current events, and the public discourse will suffer. According to a poll from Where America Stands, 45% of people have at least once not stated an opinion for fear of punishment, and nearly half would not state a political opinion on social media. Here's another example. On January 6, 2021, President Trump stated that the 75 million great American patriots who voted for me will not be disrespected or treated unfairly in any way, shape, or form. In response to this tweet, Twitter has permanently banned him from expressing his opinions on the social media platform. While comments like this may not be necessary, whether they should or should not be allowed is debatable. Furthermore, the First Amendment is supposed to protect our freedom of speech from being suppressed. Freedom of speech should only be suppressed when there is insurmountable evidence of harm, actual violent harm. While history shows us that the most damaging anti-free speech movements tend to be secular efforts involving government-mandated or government-encouraged speech controls, other entities are now affecting our freedom of speech. If companies are allowed to control what gets to the citizens, how long will it be before the government controls what we can say? If Americans don't fight for our freedom of speech, we will soon end up like China, North Korea, and Russia, where the government controls what the people can say and what information gets to the citizens. George Orwell reminds us that no one can get up much enthusiasm for a government that throws you in jail if you open up your mouth. Therefore, we must fight for true freedom of speech, which allows for one of the indispensable foundational stones of a democratic society and is one of the primary requirements for the welfare and evolution of every man. Now that we see how freedom of speech is already being affected in the United States, let's look at how these examples will affect our country. Without everyone being able to tell their side of the story, the whole truth may never be divulged. People deserve the ability to gather information and draw their own conclusions on what is true or false. People should strive to engage in topics that they disagree upon, instead of reacting in hate and canceling that person that they disagree with. Restriction of speech results in loss of trust as well. How can people know what to trust when the information they receive is restricted based on personal viewpoints? If fear of being canceled causes people to self-censor, that harms the public discourse. As advocate Roscoe Pound states, we are becoming very insensitive in this country of even necessary freedom of speech. Without our freedom of speech, we lose our individualism and our right to stand up and defend the beliefs that we stand behind. George Orwell's words remind us that what is needed is the right to print or say what one believes to be true, without fear of bullying from any side. Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza expresses that unless citizens in a democratic society are led to share values of truth, cooperation, equality, and solidarity, we will often fail to understand what each other has to say. If Americans wish to understand anyone at all, we must be allowed to hear all sides of the story. If we wish to have any freedom, we must protect our freedom of speech, because without the right to defend our freedoms, they become non-existent. In defining freedom, Orwell states that if liberty means anything, it means the ability to stand up and tell people what they do not want to hear. We must push towards a better society and free speech by all, not just speech handpicked by one side of the aisle or the other.